To the audience, a good afternoon. My name is Jean-Yves Maillard from Cardiff University in the UK, and I've got the pleasure to host this Weber teleclass tonight. And I've got the pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight, with the Professor Mahmood Bhutta. A few words about Professor Bhutta. Is the inaugural chair in ear, nose, and throat surgery, and Professor of Sustainable Healthcare at Brighton and Sussex Medical School in the United Kingdom. He's also honorary consultant on clinical green lead for the University Hospital Sussex. He has a long-standing interest in environmental and labor rights harms caused by medical supply chains. But just talking to Professor Bhutta just before this today class, we're very lucky to have him tonight, as he's a very busy man, because not only he's still working as a surgeon, he's also an academic dealing with, collaborating with many countries around the world, have a role in the WHO as well, and other leading academic project in the UK. So a very busy man. So we're very grateful for Professor Bhutta's presence tonight. So his talk is Policy and Practice for Environmentally Sustainable Products in Healthcare. So Professor Bhutta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Yves, and thank you for those who are joining today. So I understand some of you may have heard my talk on a related topic, really, last year. And so I'm going to sort of certainly mention some of those ideas, but for those who are interested, you may wish to look at my previous talk where I go into much more detail about some of the problems that have led to our throwaway culture. So my interest really is in how healthcare contributes to some of the environmental harms that we're seeing, and in particular, the products that we use. All of us will recognize, of course, that particularly in hospitals, there is a huge amount of products that we're using. I'm actually taking a slightly different stance here, and I'm going to talk about some of the history in terms of how we get here, because as we unravel the difficulties of changing very big systems, for me, I'd like to understand how we got to this position. So if you'll bear with me and allow me to indulge myself, if you like. This is ultimately, of course, what we're talking about. I hope that the audience are all on board with the idea that climate change is here, that climate change is real, and that perhaps we all have some responsibility to act and to understand what we can do to save what I still think is the most beautiful thing, which is our planet Earth. In essence, a living being that coordinates everything across our planet, and which unfortunately seems to be at the moment suffering. So ultimately, this is what it's about. But one of the issues I have is, of course, humans are in many ways the most successful creature on this planet, and in many other ways, of course, the most destructive creature on this planet. The human brain is what has led to where we are today. And the human brain is the most advanced processing system that exists. And it includes, of course, thought and abstract thoughts and concrete thoughts. So we have different ideas. The abstract conceptualization is where we bring in ideas. We can think of planning. That's linked to language in particular. Language allows us. I'm an ENT specialist. I'm specialized in ears and hearing. I'm very obsessed with language, because I say that language is the basis of being human. But linked to that is our ability to form abstract concepts, so we can communicate ideas. So let's be clear, we're the only species with language. I know that other species of animals have words, but they do not have language. Language is the ability to put concepts together to come into an idea. And we have both abstract concepts and concrete concepts. Abstract concepts, as I mentioned, but the concrete concept is something that we can actually experience. And that is very much linked actually to our visual cortices. So this is images of functional MRI scans, which is where we take an MRI scan of the brain and we look at activity within the brain in real time in terms of what's happening. And when people are presented with abstract concepts and thought to think about them, the red areas here are what lights up in the brain. With the concrete concepts, the blue areas, what you see is that two areas do not overlap. So I think we do have an incredibly complex brain. We have an ability to take on difficult ideas, to process those ideas, to share them with others, to pass on those ideas through generations. But the abstract and the concrete are separated to some extent in our brain. What that means is some abstract concepts, for example, for an infection control community, when microbes came around, it was such a bizarre idea that there were living creatures that we cannot see that could harm us. You'll be well aware of that history. And now we have another threat, of course, climate change, that is so separated that it can be difficult for us to see this thing that is actually ravaging our planet. But in addition, what this means is that that which is near to us, that which we can see, is what we seem to care about and what we think about, and that which is distant becomes abstract and difficult. And what I would argue is the world that we have built has become very abstract. And what I'm going to try and show you is the realities of how we've gotten here. Now, sorry if I'm teaching you things that you already know, but in relation to this, there are other ideas about abstract thought and concrete intelligence and abstract intelligence. So there's actually two types of intelligence that are recognized, something called fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is our ability to take on new ideas, to process those ideas, and to make decisions in a dynamic way. That is fluid intelligence. And I'm afraid to say, unless any of us are around the age of 18 and 19 in the audience, we are past our peak for fluid intelligence. So these are multiple studies that have been done on, undertaken on humans and their ability to take on new ideas and form new concepts. And I'm afraid I'm an old man. That fluid intelligence in my brain is going down and down and down. That crystallized intelligence, which is based upon our experience, continues to sort of slowly rise, the wise old man. But the wise old man, or woman, of course, cannot necessarily take on new ideas. This is also a potential problem because, of course, the people who are in positions of authority and power perhaps aren't so nimble in responding to some of these new concepts and new ideas. Humans have existed in their modern form, Homo sapien, for around 300,000 years. And for the vast majority of that time, human existence was very, very different to what it is now. So if you look at ancient cultures, and I have, as you may have heard, and I continue to work in various countries, but I have seen some of the relics of how we used to live. This, for example, is the Australian Aboriginal population who lived separated from all other human populations for 50,000 years. And they lived in existence with their surroundings. So it was a nomadic lifestyle, but also a recognition that we are actually part of nature. We are not separate to it. And a recognition that we need to respect nature and we need to respect that which is around us. So the Aboriginal Australian will, if they kill a kangaroo, for example, to eat it, they will pray to the spirit of the kangaroo and give thank that this life force has been given to them. And it's interesting that I've also spoken to Inuits, for example, living up in the northern areas of Canada, of course, and Greenland, and they have the same idea. They have this Inua, this life force that we must not destroy. Now, I'm not sort of romanticizing that everything that happened in the past was wonderful, that there was no conflicts between tribes, but this idea that we are actually part of nature is actually feeding into our concrete parts, because people could see that the world around them was very much part of who they were. What we killed was what we ate. We could not destroy what is around us because we would destroy ourselves, because that was what our food source was. That was how we lived. I would argue that this is actually the normal human existence. If for 50,000 years, populations all around the world lived in this way, that feels like a natural conclusion to human ideas and spirits. Of course, things changed, and one of the major changes was, of course, agriculture, where when we developed farming, that revolutionized things because no longer did we need a nomadic existence. No longer did we need to necessarily consider how nature could nurture us. We could start to control nature. And although it took place, many thousands of years ago, it was really only around 3 or 4 thousand years ago that this really started to develop, where we could control the land to grow the food we needed, and we could actually take in animals that we wanted to assist with that, but also for us to eat. We no longer needed to hunt. And what that did was, of course, completely change the dynamics of what we were doing in terms of the land is now there to serve us. This was the other thing, of course, money. So this is one of the oldest coins that exists. It allowed us to trade in things and allowed us to put a value on something that goes beyond what is actually concrete. It goes into what is the abstract. And through that, of course, we have now developed these ideas of we can trade in this substance, this representation of what value is. And we can put value on things that are now very different to the values that would exist in nature. And this, again, really only came about a few thousand years ago. Probably in the region of 3 to 4,000 years ago, did money really take off to any significant degree. Of course, it is now a worldwide phenomenon and a phenomenon that dominates human existence. I have to apologize because it was the British that really took this to a different level. In 18th century UK, so we're talking 300 years ago, what happened is that the feudal lords, those who controlled land, because England still is, I'm embarrassed to say, a rather uneven country in terms of income distribution, but certainly hundreds of years ago, there was an elite of extremely rich, and the vast majority were poor, as has occurred in many other European countries. But in those 300 years ago, people would indeed own land, and they would use the land for growing crops, and they may actually use the crops to feed what is around them and the people that served them. But things changed 300 years ago, where this idea became that actually, rather than just feeding those who served and were around us and were peasants, maybe we could sell this food elsewhere. This food could go outside of the locale and be sent elsewhere. That is obviously where the land became a mechanism of trade, a mechanism of using that money as a mechanism of power. And of course, this has taken over. The amount of land that we have now destroyed to allow us to have money, to allow us to have power, to put value on money rather than nature, is what has led to the huge destruction of our planet. And let's not forget that that money concept also extended to who is going to help us to work this land. So again, I'm embarrassed that, the UK was participating in this, the slave trade, where we could actually dehumanize these people. These people were different. They're not humans. We can put monetary value on them in that we pay them no money, of course, because they are not human. We do not need to care about them. But we can use them and their labor to generate and to till the land, to generate, for example, sugar, so that we can prosper. And I'm afraid this is all about money and about taking the land to get to where we need to be. We, of course, being those who are affluent. And of course, slavery did end. And some say it was because of, the people recognizing that these people are indeed humans. Others tell me that the slavery ended because of the Industrial Revolution in England, which led to machines being able to take over these individuals for what they were doing at a much higher rate and a much lower cost. And some say the British actually put through the idea for abolition of slavery because they recognized that if the French, who were their competitors in sugar, were also unable to have slaves, that the UK would win, because the Industrial Revolution came to the UK first. We would be able to produce sugar cheaper than they could if we got rid of slave labor, and we would dominate the world markets. And of course, the Industrial Revolution was founded on the idea of fossil fuels. We suddenly had this ability to dig up dead animal bodies, of course, which is what fossil fuels are, to burn those dead bodies, which is somewhat ironic that we are actually killing life now, of course, by burning dead bodies of animals through obviously the extraction, which has now come to a very large extent. And this, again, of course, breeds power and our ability to generate money and to destroy our land using fossil fuel energy to do so at scale. This has led to incredible inequalities in the world. I mean, don't get me wrong, there were inequalities before, but when we lived an existence such as in the Aboriginal populations, the inequalities were relatively very, very minor. You would have a group leader, but actually we lived as communal animals. We looked after each other, and those existences still occur in those ancient civilizations because there was no other way. People did not have these degrees of power over each other, and we did not have these abstract conceptualizations of what power, money, and the land was for. This is the UN report looking at, recently released actually, looking at what has happened in terms of the growth. So it won't surprise you that over the last 50 years or so, our demand for energy, which is almost dominated still in the world by fossil fuels, has gone up. Associated with that, our greenhouse gases have, of course, gone way beyond what our planet can hold. We are creating the biggest changes in our atmosphere that have been witnessed over a short time frame ever. There have been climatic changes in the past, but none have occurred in as rapid a time frame as we are seeing now. And the extraction of materials as well, as you can see, has gone up. That obviously has a finite amount. There is only so many materials that are in this planet, and therefore that will end. Look at the labor as well. I'd like to tell you that, slavery has ended, but that is simply not true. Today, there are around 30 million people living in forced labor, working in conditions that are horrendous, akin to slavery. They are forced to work for very little money. That is a human invention. This seems very different to the Aboriginal land that we saw. There's interesting ideas as well here. So beyond that, we have now moved to how else can we extract the most? How can we control power? Now, a lot of the world is about marketing. It is influencing people's minds to feed into these ideologies that this is the way that we must live. Of course, we all see this in our lives being sold things. On average, most companies will spend around 11 to 12% of their revenue on advertising around the world. Most of the money is actually about trying to persuade people that they need things or they need this thing differently. And there are some interesting ideas that happened before. So ExxonMobil, I don't know if any of you are aware, is published in the journal Science. These were some released data from the 1970s on what ExxonMobil, one of the largest suppliers of fossil fuels in the world, had undertaken some experimental data in the 1970s to look at what's going to happen if they continue to burn fossil fuels. Climate change is nothing new. The first paper that was written about the potential effects on the climate of burning fossil fuels was written in the 1930s in the UK. In the 1970s, ExxonMobil decided to ask some scientists at this very relatively new idea of, can you actually model what's going to happen to our planet if we keep on burning fossil fuels? The black lines there show what in the 1970s was modeled to happen to Earth temperatures. The red line is what's actually happening. It was an almost perfect fit of what they predicted. But all of this was covered up because this is not good marketing. Who wants to know that fossil fuels are going to destroy our planet? So at the time, ExxonMobil covered it up. They poo-pooed the science. They were not scientists, but they didn't want anybody to know. This was uncovered, as I say, released some data 2 years ago. We all talk about carbon footprints. Carbon footprints is your ability to measure the carbon emissions of a particular process. And sure, I do carbon footprints as well, but I don't try to carbon footprint everything. I have to do carbon footprints because I have to show to people that, for example, reusing medical products is far, far better for the planet than throwing them away. Because some people try to argue, it's the companies, of course, that try to argue with me. Interestingly, carbon footprinting was invented by BP, British Petroleum, another major supplier of fossil fuels. They actually paid a marketing company in 2004 to come up with something called a carbon footprint. The idea was that each of us is responsible for what we do and the harm we cause to the planet. And so this, for example, up here, that footprint there is what the typical carbon footprint of a human person is living in an affluent country. It detracts from the fact that BP and all the fossil fuel industry have been major contributors to this. So it was a marketing ploy. We use carbon footprinting now, but let's not forget where it came from and how it's trying to distract us from the truth of what has happened to our planet. This also exists in medicine. So in many ways, medicine can be a noble ideology. I don't, again, kid myself that it's always been a noble truth. But Hippocrates, of course, is rightly celebrated as trying to push forward the ideals of what medicine should be about. And indeed, he was interesting in that he said the best medicine is the one that is never needed. He promoted the idea of public health, of trying to avoid medical intervention where possible. And I obviously went into medicine to try and pursue these ideologies, but I'm not sure that what I see is always related to those ideals. Medicine can also be about making money. And for me, that seems unpleasant. Medicine also produces waste. And as I say, a large number of you will have seen, obviously, in your hospitals. And it wasn't always this way. I can tell you some data now from England. We estimate that 3/4 of everything that is used in healthcare now is disposable. And this is where those of you who are in infection control, we need to support the reuse economy as it used to be, not through unsafe practice, but through actually being bold in what we can do. There are 240,000 tons. That's the equivalent of around 6,000 African elephants of medical waste thrown away from our hospitals every single year, just in England. I'm sure it's even worse in other countries who are affluent and bigger than ours. This simply is incongruent with a healthy planet. And so we need to rethink our ways of doing this. And that is really where I've been focusing my work on. And let's not forget that there can be these forces for making money also related to healthcare products, particularly when we have this bizarre idea that I don't pay for the product. So in the UK, the taxpayer pays because the health system is free. So I can use as a surgeon whatever I want. Perhaps in other countries, such as the US, it is the insurer that pays. So again, I don't need to worry about it. Someone else will pay. But of course, the planet will pay. Here is one thing I find abhorrent. This is called a harmonic scalpel. It's a surgical dissector. It is used to electrocoagulate blood vessels when dissecting certain tissues. A fantastic piece of equipment, can be very helpful, but it is single use. Inside here, as I'm showing you, there is a chip inside that is programmed to allow this to be used only once. There are companies, device reprocessors, that can make this reusable, but they have to take it apart and put in place a new chip to allow it to be reused. This is planned obsolescence. And let's be clear, there is only one reason for this, and that is money. And I'm showing you one example. The excuses you might make, oh, it's very difficult to make it reusable. Oh, infection control. I simply do not buy that. It is possible for humans to put enough brains together to put someone on the moon, but yet we can't make a reusable version of this device. So some of you may have seen my previous talk, and if those of you are interested want to go into the details. But medical products, we found that half of them are manufactured outside in high income countries because, of course, the money is perhaps in the marketing. Who wants to produce a product in an expensive area? That's not true for everything, of course. Some products are manufactured in high income countries, but certainly if it's disposable, doesn't make sense. Let's outsource it. 70% of the world's surgical instruments are manufactured in Pakistan. These are the conditions. I've seen them myself. There are children, which is always a motive, children as young as 7 working in these factories. They make the high quality things as well as the disposable things. But it's an abstract concept. We can't see that. I just use these instruments. Who knows where it comes from? These children hate these work. They get injuries. What choice do they have? But this is what happens when we throw things away and when we want and we dominated by the idea of money. If we didn't throw things away, we can change the way we think, and actually we can respect those who make these products for us, and we can respect our planet as well. The other example I always show is of gloves. So again, the details are in my previous talk for those who want to. But gloves are manufactured, the 70% again are manufactured in Malaysia, where there is forced migrant labours, workers coming typically from Nepal and Bangladesh, countries that have not had the economic benefits. And we can say there are reasons why. The realities are, when you live in a country like Nepal, where the people are very nice, but they are in a mountainous area, they are in a landlocked country, you cannot trade, you cannot destroy your land to make things for other people, to give you power. Therefore, you are poor. Therefore, you will be coming as a forced migrant worker working in these factories. We found that they pay typically $2,000 to come and work in these factories. They are desperate because, of course, they need money. The whole world runs on money. These are the gloves that we put on our hands when we go to work. How do we deal with this? I would argue that we need lots of different strategies. In the NHS, the National Health System in England, I've been working for some time with organisations to try and tackle these very, very big structural problems. And I don't kid myself that we're going to be able to deal with all of these problems, because these problems are bigger than myself, of course. There is criticism, however, from me about the approach. So one approach is to say, hey, let's get individual hospitals to sort this problem out. The NHS has produced this guide on producing a green plan, which is basically asking organisations themselves to look at what they are doing and to look at their estimated carbon footprint and to then work out how they're going to make things better. We're actually about to publish a review which shows there's been just about zero progress. I'm not surprised at that. Healthcare institutions are incredibly busy. They don't have the expertise, and the idea that they can deal with things that are perhaps even bigger than them is, I think, naive. There are some examples of good practice, but has it translated to transformational change in the way that we deliver things at a scale and pace that is necessitated by the climate catastrophe? No. And I've also worked for nearly 20 years now on trying to look at labour rights issues in our supply chains, which I can give you many other examples. For example, masks manufactured using forced Uyghur labour in China. If you want to read about the genocide of the Uyghur population by the Chinese state, then you can do. But some of them were making masks that were coming, we know, into the US and into the UK, maybe even today. We know that there are some gowns that were manufactured using forced North Korean labour coming into the UK. These questions are not being asked. The response initially was this guidance from the government, and I must admit I was involved with it, but I had some reservations. An ethical procurement for health workbook, where we ask institutions, oh, can you deal with this massive problem? You are, as a hospital, look at what you're buying, and why don't you try and deal with the labour rights issues? That all sounds lovely, but the reality is, what institution, what single hospital can deal with these issues and has, again, the knowledge or the power to deal with very, very big problems. I'm not saying we should not try. I'm not sure this is the only thing we need. There are other solutions that are being tried. This is Norway. Norway has been asking all of its hospitals to look at decarbonizing their health system, and they've given them clear metrics to measure. That is a start. At least you say, hey, here's some targets, here's what you should do, tell us what you're doing, and you can work on some things such as eliminating desflurane, a toxic greenhouse gas used as an anesthetic agent, now banned in the UK because it has 3,000 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. And Norway is requiring its hospitals to report against this. So that is one mechanism. And we're looking now at how we develop similar tools for the NHS in England to actually accelerate this change. But of course, institutions need support. But I would say we need something bigger than that. And this is what I'm trying to work on, is on the policy to change the structures in delivering healthcare. So over the last few years, I've been working to generate the evidence to show that, surprise, surprise, reusing things in healthcare is the only mechanism, or the best mechanism, I should say, for reducing the environmental impact. We save between 38 and 56% of the carbon of products if we reuse them in healthcare. That includes sterilization and decontamination. So what we need is people to support that process, to say, yes, well, how can we make this the right way? How can we make this safe? Sometimes we throw things away because it's inconvenient. It's convenient to throw them away. Sometimes we have unfounded risks about infection control. Sometimes, of course, there are founded concerns about infection control. But let's be a bit more optimistic. I produced this policy brief, or rather my team did, about reducing the environmental impact of medical devices adopted for use in the National Health Service. And we were pretty critical of what the government was doing. They were trying to, again, say, hey, companies, can you try to reduce your carbon footprint a little? And we said, no, you need to look at what is going on in terms of our throwaway culture and how we can reverse that trend. I'm glad to say that the UK government now has a Design for Life roadmap, which in essence says that by 2035, they will try to minimize the amount of single-use products used in healthcare as part of its commitment to green strategy. We're still trying to work out what that looks like, but it needs a large-scale change in our health system, and it needs that to come from the top, because it is only at that level of institutional support that we can create change. And I am already saving, just in my hospital alone, £300,000. So what? Around 400,000 US dollars every year, just from a few small things I've instigated to stop throwing things away. So if you are wedded to the idea of money, and I don't think we can ever get rid of the idea of money, of course, then even on that metric, as well as the metrics of our planet and preventing abuse of workers, this is the right strategy. And that strategy at top level is also what's required to tackle these very difficult issues entrenched with forced labor abroad. There are many, many instances of forced labor in many, many different industries, particularly things like textiles and agriculture. But in healthcare, we've also been fortunate to try and create some change. So working with organizations that work on workers' rights, we produced this report. This is the evidence you need to say this is not right, to move forward. And an organization called Impact and a particular lawyer called Andy Hall had very, very strong views that this was illegal. This was against the law, what was happening to these migrant workers, paying between $2,000 and $5,000 to work in these factories, illegal recruitment fees, working 13-hour days, typically working at least 3 months without a single day off. This was forced labor, illegal in every country, but just not enforced. And I'm glad to say that we were able, through his action and the action of my colleagues, to create change. And the only thing that created the change, it wasn't saying, hey, this is wrong, can you make it better? Because I can tell you that back in 2016, I highlighted this issue. I was aware that there were issues with gloves. And the response I got from Top Glove, the world's largest manufacturer, was to threaten me with the legal action rather than to deal with the problem. The change only came after the pandemic, when suddenly everybody became aware of gloves, where some companies actually were banned from supplying the US. That hit their bottom line. Top Glove is estimated lost $750 million from its largest market by being banned. Four other glove suppliers were also banned by the US because it was indeed determined, based upon the evidence given to them, that these gloves were made using illegal forced labor. That finally led to a change. I can't tell you it's all been worked out, but 150 million US dollars has been repaid to these workers in illegal recruitment fees, and that is not allowed to happen anymore. It's still not a nice working environment, but it's on the radar and things are improving. I don't want you to take away from this that it's only that large scale change that can create change, but it would also be naive to say that it's people working in every single hospital that are going to create the large scale change that we need to do. So there are opportunities for those of you who are working in organizations to also lead some change. I've been trying slowly over the last few years to produce some guidance on what is safe and what is environmentally preferable. That includes, for example, so I chaired a national report into greener surgery, looking at all the evidence for surgical care, because surgery is terrible. We're responsible for about a third of all hospital waste. Looking at what surgery could do to green, to make our practice greener. But I was also involved in creating a green theatre checklist, which tells organisations what you should be doing to be greener, and that includes an evidence base. There is no reason that anywhere in the world, any high income country, should be using disposable drapes and gowns, for example. We know that with correct processes, they're completely safe, yet we continue to throw things away because it seems easier. I've also been working with my specialty organization, ENT UK. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. We've just released, just before Christmas, no, sorry, actually last month, some guidance on how to not use so much equipment for removing wax, how to reuse your instruments in A&E, and how to reuse your endoscopes in the outpatients. This is guidance, and so I hope it enables those on the ground to say, this is what we need to do. Badged by infection prevention experts to say this is the standard, and to stop some of that variation and that convenience. We need to measure performance against this, and there are debates about whether we should be using a carrot or a stick. So ultimately, this is, and I'm going to end soon, this is about human behavior. I don't want to hear these technological solutions. We need those as well, of course, but some people seem to have this bizarre idea that it's a technological solution that we need to create a healthier planet. We do need some technology, but actually it's a socio-cultural phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that has been driven by our abuse of the land, using money as a metric for what is important, that allows us to destroy things, that allows things to become so far away, that is so removed from what is a natural human existence that had existed for 50,000 years. And sure, I can come down with mandates and legislation that says this is the way you must do it. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps in some cases that is what's needed, because otherwise we cannot create some of the changes. Human behavior takes a long, long time, and culture takes a long, long time to shift. And I'm afraid is still somewhat dominated by that which is close to us, because of our concrete brains that can only deal with that which is close to us. And that abstract thing is very difficult for us even to conceptualize. Perhaps more different to legislation, we just need some guidance that enables those who want to move things forward. This thing in the middle, hey, I give you permission to do this, from an authority that says we're going to cover your behavior. Perhaps we need, as on the right here, people to just actually take action themselves. It's probably all of those. And I can't tell you that there is one solution, because human behavior is not down to one thing, and different people respond in different ways. And ultimately, this is still a very abstract concept, because it is creating guidance and legislation and ideas to create change. So maybe this also seems abstract, but I don't know how else we can turn the tide of where we've got to, because it was policies on land use. It was policies on what money means. It was policies on how we can enslave people that led to this problem. And I can only see policies that try to change those things that will take us back. And although this seems abstract, I hope that we will all remember that under all of this, there is something very, very concrete that we are trying to save. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Mahmood, for that talk. Plenty of food for thought. So we've got a bit of time for me, if you don't mind, asking you a couple of questions or having a bit more thoughts about that. I certainly would agree with you. I mean, everything is driven by money. I think there is no change here, that things will continue to be driven by money. So it is a way forward, a demonstrating that reusing some equipment or disposable consumables will actually save money, and maybe that's one of the, I won't say easiest, but more probably possible way to change behavior. I mean, you provided an example in the hospital where you said you managed to save £300,000 by showing you can reusing items as well. So do you think that that's a more likely way forward, or not?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm still sharing. I assume you wanted me to not stop sharing, but I can do. Yes, absolutely. I'm not naive to the fact that, what I've said is some utopian ideal where we don't have money and that doesn't matter. Of course, money is still going to drive us. So in that report I produced about green surgery, we actually looked at over 100 case studies of examples of green practice, and every single one of them saved money. Now, there might be reporting bias, of course, but overall, green saves money. So as we're going through, we are trying to look at the financial cost and benefit for all of these things. So we know studies that were done by the National Health System, for example, if you move to reusable drapes and gowns, certainly in our system, you save half of the money. So if that's not going to drive it, then I don't know what else will. I suppose it's a complex, multifaceted problem. And what I'm trying to do is align everything, indeed the finance. But the first thing has got to be actually, this is safe. And because that is what we're in healthcare for. So I guess what I'm saying to the audience that might be around infection control is that's where you can come in to say, hey, there's bodies that say this is safe, this is completely safe, and certainly signal to industry to say, we're not going to be buying that disposable things in the future. So you're right, the money, I think, will be a major driver, as well as the regulations.
Now, you mentioned infection control, and I was wondering, and I probably know the answer. I guess when you work with your team developing those guidance documents, I assume you've got some infection control professionals as part of those documents that really look how, as you mentioned the word safe,
Yeah.
it is to reuse those items.
Yes, absolutely. So for the Green Surgery Report and the Green Theatre Checklist, I am partnered with Jenny Wilson, who's a professor of infection control in the UK. And again, for the ENT UK guidance, we had the Infection Prevention Society. So you're absolutely right. We have to say that this is safe and badged by an organization that is safe. But, I won't go into the details, but in my previous talk, I gave some bizarre examples, where people will throw away pulse oximeters. They will throw away blood pressure cuffs because they might have bacteria on them. Well, of course they have bacteria on them. They've touched our skin. So this is where we need to move to something sensible that says accepts risk, but the risk is minimal. And showing some bacteria that live on a product in contact with intact skin does not mean we throw it away. And I think we also need to embrace new technologies, new ways of doing things. There are things that are developing that can clean endoscope channels. There are ultraviolet light being developed. So we just need to embrace these new technologies. But when we change everything and we say we will preferentially purchase reusable products, that is what our market will be, then that's where we move forward. And that's certainly something that we're seeing in the UK. So I think there's lots of work still to be done, but it's just about people being mindset changing, I guess, to say that this is okay. And I find risk a slightly bizarre thing because, of course, there's risk in everything. The risk should not be zero. The risk should be acceptable. I'm a surgeon. I drill into people's skulls every week or every other week, and that's slightly risky.
Is there a bit of a catch-22? Because when you get those reusable items and so on. You need to show that you've got a process in place to be able to, I guess, decontaminate them or reuse them safely. And I
Yeah.
guess those processes that they're not always available, or do those companies that provide those, I guess, reusable items thought about the, um, the reprocessing mechanisms by which to make the items safe again?
Yes, absolutely. So there is complexities there, and I'm actually meeting with the UK government tomorrow to talk about how do we develop the infrastructure across our country to enable products to be safely decontaminated or sterilized to allow reuse. And that can happen at an individual hospital level. It can happen at national centres, for example. Our work has shown that it doesn't matter whether you do it in your hospital or you do it at a, you have to transport it by car to somewhere else. It still saves so much more carbon than throwing things away, and usually saves money. So you're right, we need the infrastructure. We need it to be convenient as well, because healthcare staff are so overburdened. So you're right, but I don't think that that should be a barrier. There will be certain cases, of course, where things cannot be reused. Of course, I'm not suggesting at the moment we move towards reusing needles, for example. That's just too high risk and probably not going to be worthwhile in terms of our material use. But there are many, many other things, as I say, that we can do and that we need to be more ambitious about. But you're right. So I always say that there's three things that drive throwing things away. One is the sort of patient safety perception in terms of safety, and sometimes that's right, and sometimes it's not quite right. The second thing is the finance. It seems it seems cheaper to throw things away. That's actually rarely true. In some cases, it will be true, but rarely so. And the third thing is the sort of infrastructure to make it convenient to reuse and easy to reuse. And that's the decontamination and sterilization. Because the truth is, if I'm busy and I haven't got an easy way to sterilize or decontaminate something, it's easier for me from a human behavior perspective to just throw it away.
Have there been any, maybe my last questions for the day, has there been any lesson learned from COVID-19? Because at the start, there was a huge shortage of PPE and items, and there's been a quite few development of how to reprocess safely those type of equipment so they can be reused. Have there been any lesson learned, or a guidance to use actually such a I guess a new processes to reuse those items you mentioned in your talk? I mean, like gloves and gowns. I mean, I would ask face masks because we work on a process in my lab for reprocessing a face mask very safely. So have there been any, I said, a lesson learned on advances on those, on recommending those practices?
Um, uh, Yes, I think so. So the pandemic was obviously horrible. It was horrible for the planet as well, in terms of we all saw, with our eyes, with our concrete conceptualization, because it is visual. As I said, that's very much what we see when we see the PPE. Our brain understands that there is a problem here that it did not understand before. So, what have we learned? I hope we've learned that we need true experts in infection control to guide what we did. I'm not persuaded that we needed all that PPE. Why were we telling people to wear gloves and gowns for a respiratory virus when, of course, we should have been washing our hands and probably wearing masks? So, there's that aspect in terms of let's learn to take a more nuanced and sensible view of infection control. I think what's also learned is how reliant we were on our supply chains and how little resilience we had in our health systems to this. So it did indeed spur lots of science on how do we move and how can we enable reuse. Now, it hasn't always worked. I don't know what your experience is with face masks. It's a bit difficult because people don't necessarily want to wear someone else's face mask. And so it's about, well, do you have your own face mask? There's questions as well about whether we need face masks at all. There's interesting lack of evidence that face masks make any difference during surgery, except possibly for implant surgery. So do we need them at all is the bigger question that we might ask. but it's also led to new things. So the UV technology that I was talking about, there are some companies. So just to be clear, I have no commercial interest in anything. I'm not trying to promote anything, but there are companies looking at ultraviolet to decontaminate anesthetic face masks. And that was inspired by some of the work that was going on during the pandemic to say, hey, how can we be more resilient and not have to rely on our supply chains overseas to buy everything? We just make sure we have everything we need. So resilience has become a major topic. And if that is a driver as well for how we stop throwing things away and help our planet by accident, then that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly would agree with you with the face mask. The biggest problem was would you use a mask that had been used by someone else? And the answer is probably no. And the idea was actually you're using the face mask you used before, but has been reprocessed. Well, thank you very much for that talk on your further thoughts on the subject. To the audience, it's almost the time to leave. So before we do so, let me tell you about the forthcoming a teleclass coming. Well, in February, on March and April, you can see on this slide, we've got quite a number of them. Very, again, interesting talks. On hopefully you'll be able to attend those teleclass. Lastly, I'd like to thank our patron sponsors, Diversey, Virox, and Gamma, that have been kindly supporting the teleclass education over the years. To the audience, thank you very much for listening. To Professor Bhutta, thank you again for that very interesting talk tonight. To the audience, thank you very much.